The Austin Manifesto was drafted by James Buchanan, John Mason, and Pierre Sol after Sol failed to purchase Cuba from Spain when Cuba was fighting for its independence. This is prior to the Spanish-American War. This manifesto suggested that the U.S. should take Cuba from Spain by force if Spain refused to sell it, but abolitionists saw this as a plot to extend slavery. Southerners supported the manifesto as they had feared Cuba would become a free black republic because at the time they still had slavery also, and so there was substantial fear that if Cuba gained its independence from Spain, those freed blacks would come over here and incite riots. Evolution of the major political parties to pre-Civil War. So the key moment was the debate over the abolition of a federal constitution. And at that point, the main parties were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and they agreed about the extent to which the federal government should have power, as well as the role of the Constitution. And then after the Constitution was adopted, the Jeffersonian Republicans emerged. They're going to take over the Anti-Federalists, and there's no need for the Federalists anymore because the Constitution was passed. And then there was disagreement over John Quincy Adams' defeat of Andrew Jackson. So you're going to have the Jacksonian Democrats are going to be formed. This is going to be the Democratic Republicans and the Whig Party. Originally are going to be the ones who are opposed to Jackson. They supported Adams. And then the Democrats are going to be the ones who support Jackson. So it's kind of a mixture of the Jacksonian Republicans who supported Adams still. After the death of William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, the parties focused mostly, so after 1840-ish, the main debate between all the different Republican and Democratic parties and the know-nothings and all those are going to be primarily based on slavery. Speaking of slavery, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was legislation introduced by Stephen Douglas to organize the area west of Missouri and then around Iowa. One goal was to facilitate the building of a transcontinental railroad that would run out to California from Chicago. And it called for two territories to be created from this land here, like in the middle, and that was going to be Kansas and Nebraska. Of course, here the issue of slavery again is called into play. Now, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise had said anything north of this here line was going to get to be free, and they were technically north of the line. But popular sovereignty, where the people in the area got to decide, had become a very popular, no pun intended, idea. And so this act is issued saying, well, that was 30 years ago, it's time to updo things or redo things. And so they're going to consider the idea of, let's get rid of the Missouri Compromise. Kansas's status was impacted by fighting between pro and anti-slavery groups who moved to the area, and this conflict was known as Bleeding Kansas. There were a group of abolitionists led by John Brown who are going to conduct raids with border ruffians into Kansas and beat up the slaveholders in an effort to try to use force to influence them to vote in favor of not having slavery. In terms of the creation of Lincoln's Republican Party, the Democratic Party is going to divide along north and south lines. The Whig Party is going to disintegrate, with its members either joining the Know-Nothings or the newly created Republican Party. The Republican Party's unifying principle was that slavery should be banned from all the nation's territories and not permitted to spread any further to established states. Lincoln is going to be a member of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is largely the party of the North. Walt Whitman was a very famous poet at the time, transcendental to a certain extent. He is going to write a book called Leaves of Grass. He also writes a really famous poem when Lincoln is killed. And he is going to celebrate the importance of individualism and is considered the main poet of like American democracy. So he's like America's #1 poet. Him and I'd say Frost is right up there. James Buchanan was the 15th president. He presided over the country when the Dred Scott decision was announced, and he is going to support the Lecompton Constitution to appease the South. Still acting as president after Lincoln's election, he denied the legal right of states to secede, saying that they were not, it was not within the Constitution. Part of the Constitution was that when you ratified it, you agreed to all the lies forever. It's in perpetuity, or however you say it. And by ceding, you're giving up you're saying, no, I disagree to what I agreed to in the first place. So the whole argument was that constitutionality of succession. And basically Buchanan said, no, states don't have the right to leave. but the federal government could not legally prevent them from doing so because there wasn't anything about enforcement in the Constitution. Before leaving office, he's going to appoint Northerners to federal posts, and he's going to help prepare Fort Sumter with reinforcements. In 1857, there was also a panic or a depression. It was due to the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company in New York and over speculation in railroads and lands. People were spending way more money, basically inflating the value of railroads. There was also decreased in flow of capital from Europe, mainly because of Europe sensing that we were going to go to war, as well as Europe being in the middle of its own war. There was also a surplus of wheat. There just happened to be a bit of a drought that year, the year before. And so the next year, when the lands were better, the farmers grew more wheat than there were markets for. And so they had no market for all this labor. Panic eventually is going to spread to Europe, South America, and the Far East. And it's going to fuel sectional tensions as Northerners blamed it on the low tariff policies of the Southern-dominated Congress. So I mentioned the Dred Scott case. So basically what happened was that Dred Scott was a slave who lived in Missouri and then went to Illinois, which was a free state. And when he went to Illinois, because it's a free state, he thought he had gained his freedom. When he went back to Missouri, he thought he was still free. However, because of the fugitive slave law, he had been returned to the slave state. They said, no, you're not. You're not free. You're a slave. So he's going to sue for his freedom for himself and his family, stating that by residing in a free state, he had ended his own slavery. His slavery had ended. Buchanan meant for the case's decision to serve as the basis for the slavery issue. He's like, well, whatever happens here, let's just go with it, and that's going to be country rule. Like, if you make it to a free state, then you are freed. The pro-South judge, Tawney, ruled that Scott did not have the right of citizenship, so therefore he couldn't bring a suit of law, to court. And it ruled further that the Missouri Compromise itself was unconstitutional because Congress has no power to prohibit slavery in the territories since slaves are property. So again, just like the government can't tell you can't bring your couch to a new state, they can't tell you can't bring your slave to a new state. And so this is now saying, well, that means that every state should, in theory, be able to have slavery. The Scott decision would apply to all African Americans who are regarded as inferior and therefore without rights. The Lecompton Constitution was a document submitted by pro-slavery leaders in territorial Kansas that put no restriction on slavery. It was kind of hedged in that bet of the Dred Scott case. Free Soilers boycotted the Constitution Convention in Lecompton because the document would not leave Kansas as a free territory. Though President Buchanan supported the Constitution as the basis for Kansas' statehood, Congress voted against it. The Constitution was turned down, and Kansas therefore remained a territory. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were part of the Illinois senatorial campaign between Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln, not presidency. This is for running for Senate. And these debates centered on the issue of slavery. Douglas maintained that popular sovereignty was supported by the basic elements of democracy, and he supported the Freeport Doctrine, despite the Dred Scott case, where slavery could be prevented if people living in a territory refused to pass laws favorable to slavery. So he was basically saying, like, oh, well, we're going to have popular sovereignty, and if everybody in the state or in the territory votes against slavery, well, then slavery is not allowed. Lincoln had a moral opposition to slavery's spread and demanded constitutional protection where it existed. Lincoln lost the Senate election to Douglas, but he stepped into the national limelight. Obviously, he will run eventually for the presidency. John Brown and his sons killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in Kansas in an incident known as the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre in 1856. He was supported by some northern abolitionists in order to start a countrywide revolution. And so this is where the border ruffians and all that came in with Bleeding Kansas. Later, he is going to lead followers to seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to start what he perceived to be as his rebellion. And he was arrested and hanged for this, for treason. And he was often referred to as God's angry man, because he was very angry. From 1860 to 1900, America experienced a massive transportation revolution. Railroads were given land grants by the government, and railroad transportation provided opportunities for movement of goods and people to the west and raw materials to the east. This is going to impact how population movements occurred across the country. So you would see massive movements west as the railroad expanded out west and those types of things. It also made Chicago one of the most popular cities in the nation by 1900 because of the stockyards. So there was a lot of trade and mobility throughout Chicago. In the election of 1860, the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln. The South said that if Lincoln won, they would leave. Major planks of his campaign were containment of slavery and the encouragement of a transcontinental railroad. The Democratic vote was split between Douglas as well as several other candidates, and because the vote was split with the Democrats and the Republicans were united, the Republican candidate of Lincoln won, and this is going to prompt the secession of southern states starting with South Carolina. So Lincoln was the 16th president. The Lincoln-Douglas debates won him high national regard and eventually the Republican nomination for president. He produced and led a northern army to defend the Union against the secessionists during the Civil War, but in order to do that, he had to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And Congress said that this was okay because during war, sometimes you have to do extreme measures. The writ of habeas corpus is a legal measure that basically says, present the body. You have the right to be told why you're under arrest. Lincoln's like, well, during war, we're going to have to get rid of that. Like, we can randomly arrest people if we suspect that you are a criminal or a spy or something along those lines. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves within the Confederacy, only those who were in rebellion. The border states, which stayed part of the North but had slavery, those slaves were not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. He is going to develop the 10% plan for Reconstruction. He also gives the Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1869, 7 years ago, that whole thing. But he was assassinated while attending a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington. The assassin John Wilkes Booth believed that he was assisting the Southern cause. By now the Civil War was done, but it was kind of to make a statement. In terms of secession, this was the response by Southern states to Lincoln, who sought to contain slavery. He just didn't want it to spread. He wasn't saying anything when he got elected at first about getting rid of slavery. He was just saying that slavery wouldn't spread to new territories. South Carolina is going to be the first state to cede, and this is December 20th, 1860. Over the following 2 months, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas would all leave. The remaining, it should say states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, left after the fall of Fort Sumter. These states declared themselves the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as president, adopting a constitution that permitted slavery and the sovereignty of the states. In terms of the Civil War, in order to fight it more effectively, Congress is going to pass conscription laws, which is going to be the draft, so that way they're going to be able to increase the amount of soldiers that they have. But you are going to have a lot of riots in the North among people who, they supported the idea of abolition, but they really didn't want to go and, risk their lives over the slaves. One of the most famous incidents happened in New York City when drafted individuals, basically what happened here was across the country, you could pay for your way out. You could basically hire a substitute for $300. And in New York in particular, you had a lot of really wealthy people who paid the poorer people the $300, and the poor people felt that they were being used, though nothing told them that they had to take it. And so there were going to be a lot of riots. The Confederacy's short supply of manpower meant an earlier draft beginning in 1862. Southerners could also hire substitutes. However, because they were fighting for what they viewed as their way of life, more Southerners were willing to volunteer for service. Going into the war, the South had some advantages. One was that they needed to resist being conquered because most of the fighting is going to be down there. All they had to do was fight a war of attrition. They just had to last. The South was also really, really big in size. The troops would fight in their familiar home territories, and they had probably better military generals, particularly with Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. Furthermore, they were inspired to protect their families and institutions and culture. For the North, they had a greater population, which meant that they had a continuous stream of soldiers that they could send down. They also had better railroads and more established trade routes, which was going to be effective in moving supplies. They were also more wealthy. And they were able to use the moral issue of fighting slavery as motivation. Like, oh, we're the ones who are trying to liberate this entire populace, although that isn't really what a lot of them focus on at first.